I don't know if I've ever been a mark for anyone as much as George South has been a mark for Paul Jones.
Yeah, Paul Jones, you mean George South Sr.?
Yeah,
Is that
same thing.
Because when I brought up Paul Jones's name just to George, he went, "Ow! I love him." Funny story about George South and Paul Jones is when George was in elementary school, he used to sign his papers, Paul Jones.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
He was that obsessed with Paul Jones. Like, here's this little kid who's named George South. Everybody knows he's George South. All of a sudden, one day, he's like, "No, I'm Paul Jones." And just started signing his names on all his papers.
Was that just a way to get away with all the bad grades he was getting on the papers?
I assume so. He was already creating A-lists.
Yeah.
I mean, George has always been very much underneath the radar of all federal governments. So, I mean, the man has mason jars buried in his backyard.
Yeah.
So
You got to lay a foundation at an early age.
Exactly. And Paul Jones most certainly did that for him. So.
All right. Well, welcome to 10 Bell Pod, where we discuss the life of pro wrestlers in the Manning Cave. I'm Nick Alexander, joined as always by Micah Loving.
Hello, hello, hello. I'm just going to say that over and over.
And also pro wrestler, stand-up comic, bald-headed geek, Jake Manning.
A man who definitely has no loving in his name today, who just got off a plane and only has 2 hours of sleep. So if you hear me being a little punchy today and the couple weeks after that, not to time step everything, I apologize.
It's the Lex Luger thing. Get your second wind, do 2 moves, and then you win.
I'm actually trying to get like the Ric Flair thing where I'm like all hopped up from the night before, cutting promos on TBS going, "Don't cut me off."
Rick, the lights are turning off. Shit.
All right, well, thanks for listening, and help us defeat the evil podcast algorithms by leaving us a review and a rating on wherever you're listening. Find us on social media at 10 Bell Pod. Today, we are talking about territory legend, a guy who spent 30 years in the business, having tremendous success wherever he went. It is George South's favorite wrestler, Paul Jones.
Number 1.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully you know who both those people are. If not, you're going to be educated on both in the same podcast. Except, when we do George South's podcast, there'll be a lot more crying.
Oh, God. Let's not bring that up.
Oh, no, George brings it up every time.
Oh, jeez.
Every time
That's how you conquer things like that. You remind people and then you beat it.
Every time I interview him for like a 10 Bell Pod like quote or something like that, the next thing he'll say to me is like, "Oh, well, I can't wait for you to cover me on your podcast."
That's someone sent us a message on Facebook and was like, "I would love to be on your podcast," and I was like, "No, you wouldn't."
Oh, that guy. You talked to that guy. He talked to me about how did this get booked.
Okay.
But then I saw he messaged on 10 Bell Pod. I'm like, "No, I don't think you know how this works."
That means you're gonna be dead. All right, so this episode, for me, I won't speak for Micah, but 70s wrestling is not in my wheelhouse.
Nick loves it. He's lying.
So, Jake, we need you to pretend this episode is a 6'6", 300-pound ex-football player with 2 months of wrestling school underneath him, because we're going to need you to carry this episode.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that this is going to be a 6'6" African-American woman, and we want you to fall in love with this episode. I was like, I'll marry this podcast.
Oh, we're starting off good.
To someone who has never seen Paul Jones wrestle or even manage, how would you describe him?
Most people, when they hear the name Paul Jones, they think of manager. Like, that's immediately, everybody thinks manager, Paul Jones Army. But, like, every time Paul Jones' name gets brought up in front of, like, Terry Funk or Jack Briscoe when he was alive, like all these guys that were known as like some of the best wrestlers in the world, they'd be like, "Oh, that
legends."
Yeah, they're like, oh, Paul Jones, he was one of the best ever. And you always hear that rumbling, especially in this area of the Carolinas. People always want to bring up, like, well, Paul Jones, he was a manager, but he was a really good wrestler. And, this area of, Charlotte, he was legendary. I mean, so legendary, in fact, he was such a big star, he actually had his own, like, auto body shop here. He was like, there's that level of fame in the territory areas. Like, I just saw a commercial for Jerry Lawler's furniture warehouse. So like that was always the game when you're in the territories, especially in the 70s. Like you move around to territory, you find a place that you like, and then all of a sudden you buy a business with all your pro wrestling money, and then you just settle down in that place, and that's where you live.
Like Abdullah had like a barbecue joint or something, and then Bam Bam opened a burger thing. I mean,
So that was always the game with like the old timers in the 70s. It was like, all right, I'm gonna take this pro wrestling money, I'm gonna buy a couple car washes, an auto body shop, a wrecker service, and then I now have a business, and that's how we go. Which Paul Jones did in Charlotte. But like, as far as like being a wrestler, I mean, he was kind of a shorter guy, and there was always that sense of it being like a big man's business. But the clips that I've seen of the way that Paul Jones wrestles, much in the same sense of like a Bill Dundee or Jerry Lawler, like you couldn't figure out what his height was. Just because like he wrestled like so big, and and the way he would sell and the way he would punch and his offense and everything was believable enough, even though there's the size difference. And also too, like he just looked like a dude, like he had like a normal guy, like parted hair, and had a decent little body, and he was an athlete, but he wasn't like Ricky Steamboat, who was his tag team partner, and he wasn't like Blackjack Mulligan, and he didn't have like big blonde hair like Ric Flair, but at the same time too, just as believable, but like kind of viewed as like a real tough guy and kind of a wrestler's wrestler.
When I first saw him, just the first impression I got was he wasn't as like ripped and as built as Bruno, but just kind of that everyman's kind of just going in there wrestling.
Big barrel chest.
Yeah, barrel chested, just like, and the fans loved him. He was babyface as hell, and just Bruno without the car lifting muscles was how I first interpreted Paul Jones.
Well, let's get into the life and career of Paul Jones. Paul Frederick was born June 16th, 1942 in Port Arthur, Texas. And as a teenager, he was a Golden Glove boxer, winning the Texas heavyweight and light heavyweight championship. Paul was trained to wrestle by Morris Siegel and legendary Houston wrestler and Houston promoter Paul Bosch.
I mean, Paul Bosch was... I mean, he ran Houston, and Houston was such a good territory that it was just Houston. Like, he was in the middle of Texas, and you had world class over in Dallas, you had Amarillo, and you had all these other territories just kind of around, but Houston was its own little thing that they could run like a territory system in a very small area because Houston drew so well. Wow. But also too, world-class guys would come over and wrestle in Houston, and then also Houston Wrestling had a working relationship with WWF, and Paul Bosch, just legendary promoter, class act, all the way through, nothing but good things about who he was as an individual, and just had lifelong friendships, I believe, even with like Stu Hart and like the McMahons. So just old classy wrestling promoter, just definition of the word.
Paul Frederick would make his pro wrestling debut in Houston in 1961, wrestling under the name Paul Jones. Not long after, he'd head over to San Francisco and Roy Shire's territory. He'd also work a little in Championship Wrestling of Florida, but this is not the big famous run he's going to have much later. After breaking into the business, Paul knew his next logical move would be going to the land of kangaroos and honey, Australia.
Are they known for honey? Is that a thing?
I mean, I could ask somebody. I know somebody who lives in Australia.
I've never heard the honey thing.
I've never heard the thing honey either. I could find out honey for sure. I know vegans.
It was clearly a bad play on milk and honey.
Oh,
yeah, it was. You're right on the bad part.
You're definitely right on the bad part. You're wrong on the honey part, by the way. Just to remind you again.
But you know what? It evened out with the good and the bad, so we're neutral, kicking butt.
All right, I'm gonna follow it up with this joke. He headed down to Australia's version of World Championship Wrestling, where Paul Jones had to do the airplane spin in the opposite direction. Because it's Australia.
How much Australian material do you have, Nick? You want me to carry this episode, or you got more Australia jokes?
After returning to the United States, he'd hit the territories hard, making a name for himself. He worked for Pacific Northwest Wrestling in Oregon,
Portland, brother. Portland.
holding the Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship twice. He'd also win the Tag Team Championship with Pepper Martin.
And here he was young Paul Jones because there was already a Paul Jones. So, just throw on a little personifier and there we go.
Like that's not a common name at all. There's one who's old, there's one who's young.
Yeah, that's another thing. Doing research for this episode, typing in Paul Jones.
So many people.
I mean, geez, immediately goes to wrestling. Tons of research. Don't have to go through anything. Beautiful.
In 1967, Paul hit up the Von Erichs pre-WCCW territory, Big Time Wrestling. He go to Japan with Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance, making repeat tours in 70 and 71. In 68, Paul Jones would make his debut in the promotion that would make him a star, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, just miles away from the Manning Cave. There, he'd form a tag team with Nelson Royal. You have no idea how hard it was. I wanted to say MMA fighter Roy Nelson so bad. I had to make specific notes to not say Roy Nelson.
Hopefully he's in better shape than Roy Nelson.
Hopefully.
Oh, Nelson Royal? That'd be a fair fight. That's a push.
that's a good one.
You gambling man Micah, that's a push. I would not put money against Nelson Royal.
Coin flip.
No, Nelson Royal was a tough SOB. That
would be a great fight because Roy's known for his chin and his big right hand. So shit, man.
Oh, Nelson was a classical wrestler. Also, too, I believe Nelson Royal, he was the NWA junior heavyweight champ about the same time that Harley Race was the NWA champ. And, the NWA, with them going around to territory to territory to territory to territory, you need somebody who could leave that territory with that belt. So that's why you put the belt on someone like Jack Briscoe or Harley Race, a super tough guy. Yeah. Also, the same goes with the junior heavyweight title. So obviously that just goes to show that Nelson Royal was a competent individual, knowing that no promoter was going to screw him over because Nelson was going to leave the ring with the belt no matter what. They weren't going to do any shenanigans, and if there's any issue backstage, Nelson was like, nope, this is not what we agreed upon ahead of time. This is not sanctioned by the NWA. This is not the finish I was given to me by the NWA president. I am not doing that. And if you have a problem with it, I'll meet you in the ring. And that's the type of individual that Nelson Royal was. And if I'm not mistaken, Nelson Royal was the guy who wrestled Dynamite Kid at the Stampede.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that.
Yes. And he was the guy that made Dynamite Kid. But Paul and Nelson formed a tag team. And from my research with George, which was extensive for this entire episode, George was talking about how it was always this thing with old timers when they would team together. As soon as they would break up, they would never talk to each other again. This really weird, you always hear the story of Dusty and Dick Murdoch. One day, Dusty woke up and saw, Dick Murdoch in the other twin bed in their hotel room and just saw him.
They were broken up.
And he's just like, I got to get out of here. I can't be around this guy anymore. I love him like a brother, but I can't be around him anymore. And then just split off. It was kind of that way with Paul Jones and Nelson Royal. And they just, when they broke up, they didn't talk for years. And then when Nelson passed away, George had to take Paul to Nelson's funeral. And Paul was talking about how he hadn't talked to Nelson in years, maybe even decades. Wow. And he's just like, I always meant to. I saw him so much. I just stopped talking to him out of the blue. I don't know. It's just those old times. They get weird. And as they get older, they don't want to be reminded of death by looking at somebody else, or they're closer to death by seeing somebody get older, because we all feel like we're 17 until we see one of our high school friends oh gosh, they've aged, I've aged too, and
just treat it like it's contagious.
Yeah, that's basically how that goes.
I'm good.
But yeah, it is funny considering there was a time that Paul was settled here in Charlotte, and also too, Nelson actually had a Western wear store in Mooresville, North Carolina. I believe it's still named Nelson Royal's Western Wear.
Road trip.
You should. It's a cool place. I've always wanted to go and buy cowboy boots there, because there's always this legendary story of the Rock and Roll Express in their heyday, in the prime of their career.
What were they, mid 80s, early 80s?
Yeah, it would have been their first run here, and then pulling up in like some Trans Am, Ricky and Robert, and they had Billy Jack Haynes, and they all bought like snakeskin boots.
Wow.
Like with one of their checks, and they bought like 3 pairs of them. And they're
White Snake is just blasting the fuck out of the car.
Yeah, and those boots are super expensive. But that was always the thing. Like some of the boys, when they get cowboy boots, they go to Nelson and Royal's Western wear. Also, too, a lot of Jim Crockett vignettes that were shot with like horses and ranch stuff was shot at Nelson Royal's
ranch.
Well, not ranch, but his farm right next to the Western wear store, which is now inside of Mooresville city limits. So like, there's this whole thing like the horse with Trigger and Baby Doll riding off into the sunset. That's all like Nelson Royal's horses and his farm. So also too, Nelson had like a ring set up like in a barn on his farm, and they would train wrestlers in the back of there. So
that sounds kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Paul's first Mid-Atlantic run is mostly tagging with Roy Nelson, and in September of
You mean Nelson Royal?
I really wasn't going to bring it up because I thought this was going to be a bit Nick was doing the rest of the
That was genuine. I'm going to that out.
No, this is good.
No, this is in. This is
totally
this
in.
is in.
If you delete this, we're fucking pissed.
Yeah.
Paul's first Mid-Atlantic run was tagging with Nelson.
You're even reading it off
I
the
know.
screen.
I can't. All right. And in September of '70, Paul and Nelson would beat the Minnesota Wrecking Crew for his first NWA Atlantic Coast Tag Team Championship.
Which Minnesota Wrecking Crew? Ole and Gene.
Oh yeah, fuck Gene.
Yeah, don't skip. Put some respect on Gene Anderson's name, son.
I suck.
You suck real bad. I was talking to George about that feud, and George grew up such a big fan of Paul Jones and loved Paul Jones. So obviously, he despised Ole Anderson and the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. And as George became closer friends with Paul, knowing that about George and knowing the way, the perception of professional wrestling being on the up and up, and bad guys hate good guys and good guys hate each other, like Paul would mess with George and be like, me and Ole were best friends. That whole time when like he was roughing me up and he attacked us at the Charlotte Coliseum or the Park Center or wherever we wrestled, that was what we fished together earlier in that day. We were hanging out.
We locked eyes and smiled at each other.
We smiled at each other. We went hunting after that, and George is like, "Don't tell me any of this. You are ruining my child. You're telling me
the sky's falling.
Santa Claus is real, Paul Jones. Do not do this to me."
Park Center, that's Grady Cole Center?
Yep.
Okay.
They used to, that before they were drawing larger crowds weekly, they would be at Park Center, the Grady Cole Center. That was their weekly spot. And then, of course, as the business grew, they had to do the Charlotte Coliseum. Yeah. They would still do the Coliseum for bigger shows, but the weekly basis run shows was at Park Center. And then as that business grew, they obviously had to run the Coliseum every week.
And Grady Cole, I mean, that thing's still deceptive. It still holds like what, 1,200 or something?
Close to 2,000 or something like that. But that's where George saw a lot of his first wrestling matches, mostly because of Paul Jones. Paul Jones was the first ever wrestler he saw on TV.
Yeah.
He saw Paul Jones.
Immediate bam, right in the face.
He's just like, that guy.
That's my guy.
That's my guy forever. And then he like hounded his like older brother to take him to Park Center to see him wrestle, and George would hang out kind of where the wrestlers would be like watching each other's matches, because that's what they used to do back in the day. They didn't have monitors in the back. Yeah. They would, and also too like
they're just screaming, "How's it going?"
Well, and
they relay messages.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. It was like it wasn't like the business was in the 80s. Like the 70s was a little bit different. Like obviously you had several hundred people, but like there'd be like certain corners that were kind of open where wrestlers could kind of wander up and watch the matches.
Okay, yeah.
So like George figured out where the guys were wandering up. So as a little kid, he just ran up there and he saw Paul Jones, like, oh, that's Paul Jones. And so he like went up and like hounded Paul and asked him all these questions. And Paul would be like, hey kid, you want to do me a favor? And of course George was like, oh, whatever you want, Paul Jones, whatever you want. And he'd be like, hey kid, why don't you get me a cup of coffee? And so George would run off, and George would get no money for it. He wouldn't be like, here was
I
$1.
get paid in something that doesn't matter. He gets the appreciation of Paul Jones.
But Paul Jones didn't even say, here's $1, kid, go get me a coffee.
Right.
George was just like, oh, I'm going. And then he'd take money out of his own pocket, go get Paul Jones a cup of coffee.
Paul's holding the money out and like, where's George?
Yeah, exactly. It was very much like that situation. And then as soon as George comes back, guess what? No Paul Jones.
Oh, shit.
Because is like, and George always asks him, like, why'd you always make me get you coffee and you're never there? And he goes, kid, I was trying to get you to leave me alone. You were just asking me so many questions.
Some other little kid already got me my cup of coffee quicker than you did.
But another story, since we're on George's fandom of Paul Jones, and this is roughly about the time that grew, was that George wrote a piece of fan mail to Jim Crockett Promotions office talking about how much he loved Paul Jones, and George just talked about how cool this was. He just wrote a little letter from the fan talking about how much Paul Jones was his favorite wrestler, and then Jim Crockett's office mailed him back a 5x7 picture of Paul Jones that was personalized.
Oh man.
Like not stamped, because they did do some of the stamps. Like I actually have a stamped signature of Jack Briscoe and I think Harley Race from some special event some title match that they had, and those are stamped autographs. But this particular time, this autograph that George got was an actual personalized autograph, legit signed and everything. And George was like, told me, he goes, I don't know where my grandbabies are right now. I don't know where my kids are. I have no idea where they are on this earth. But I know exactly where this 5x7 autograph picture of Paul Jones is. I could tell you right now. I could close my eyes. I could lead you into my house right now.
I could telepathically link with it.
I could tell you what it is feeling right now. That is how linked I am to this.
The closest I ever got was, I think I wrote Dominique Wilkins a fan letter, and he sent me back just a form letter. NBA Atlanta Hawks great. Grew up in Atlanta. Loved Dominique Wilkins more than anything in this world. I got a form letter back, and it was cool, but it still was like, shit.
Yeah, we were that last generation of fan mail.
Yeah, I guess now I should be very appreciative I got anything at all, because that's just...
I bet the letters never got to Dominique, just like Dominique never got to the NBA Finals.
With fucking cheating ass Larry Bird holding down the Eastern Conference, how the fuck is he supposed to do anything? Huh?
Well, I mean,
dirty
motherfucker. He was playing with a midget Spud Webb. What do you expect?
Hey, he won the slam dunk contest.
Oh,
God
shut
damn
the
it!
Fuck up. Could he shoot a three? Does he Steph Curry? I don't think so. And this has been an episode of The Herd.
Wait, real quick, Nick, did you ever write any fan letter, anything when you were a little kid? Want to get a response?
No.
No Hogan? No nothing?
But one time, John Casey, the kicker for the Panthers, went into my dad's work, and my dad got an autograph, and he spelled my name wrong.
And it's Nick, right?
Yeah. Like, come on, John Casey.
K-N-I-K.
I think he tried to write Nicholas, and it ended up being like, I don't know, like Nicolasa.
Dad, is that why your Twitter handle is what it is? John Casey?
Oh, maybe subconsciously. Holy shit.
God, we just Freuded your ass.
I know. That's...
Before we get off fan mail, I should bring up this story. This is probably the best story. This is actually how I first became aware of George South. And this is all going to tie all this back up in this whole talk about fan mail. There was a competition with Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling where to vote on your favorite wrestler, the most popular wrestler, what you had to do is, as a fan, was mail in postcards with the name of your favorite wrestler. And so, like, whoever collected the most postcards with their names on it, like, this is person my favorite wrestler, they would win, and they would be presented with a gold watch. So, George, loving Paul Jones so much, George is like, oh, I have to make sure that Paul Jones wins this gold watch. And so George cut grass all summer long so he could save up money to buy as many postcards as possible so Paul Jones could win that watch. And sure enough, Paul Jones won that watch. Years later,
oh my gosh,
George obviously had befriended Paul, and he was at his auto body shop, and George was there with his the story has changed over there. George was saying
car he had?
No. It changes with like, did he have George Jr. or did he have like his youngest son, or did he have one of his grandbabies on his knee?
Okay.
That kind of, so George's timeline is very fluctuating, but his actual structure of the story is still
stories on the grass.
It's always going to say
George South, which kid?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, did they shoot Kennedy or they shoot another president that was driving through Dallas? That's usually the debate. But he was just in Paul Jones' office. He was visiting him at his auto body shop. Obviously, Paul knew about that story about the gold watch, and then all of a sudden, like, Paul was just talking to George, and then Paul just opened up his drawer of his desk and pulled out the gold watch. Oh, shit. And George recognized it, right? And Paul didn't even say, like, you remember this? Like, he just picked it up, and like George knew immediately what it was. And as George always says, I dropped my grandbaby. And I started looking at the watch, and then all of a sudden, Paul forgot that I had the watch. And I'm like, I'm gonna get out of here. So he tried to make a break for it.
Oh no!
And then he literally run, because you're supposed to play cool with that. And just
he played cool. He played cool.
Kind of walk out.
And then all of a sudden, like, Paul realized what happened, and Paul walked out, and George's like, oh no, I gotta get out of here. And he's trying to crank up the car. All of a sudden, Paul knocked on the window. And as George always described it, he goes, I rolled down the window just enough that you couldn't fit a watch through there. But I rolled it down just enough that I could hear what he was saying and pretend like I cared before I drove off.
That's a thin line.
Paul goes, hey, I didn't tell you could keep that. And George's like heart just broke, and and he goes to reach for it, and then Paul goes, I'm just kidding, kid. You can keep it.
Oh, shit. Mean Joe Greened him.
Yeah, and exactly how George describes it. He was Mean Joe Green, but then he like turned mean again. Like, why'd you have to mess with my emotions like that?
It's a roller coaster. That's a roller coaster.
But to bring this full circle, this story got put into, I believe, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Oh. And before I moved
Metzler didn't get this shit.
I believe it was like The Wrestler. It was one of those type magazines. And before I got into professional wrestling, before I moved to Charlotte, I remember seeing a picture of these two men holding up a watch with the same exact story. And I remember reading this story. I'm like, this is a cool story. I'm like, who are these two old guys holding up this watch?
And never putting them together.
And I never put it all together. And then when George told me this story, after knowing him for 2 years, I go, oh my gosh, I remember reading this article in a wrestling magazine about this whole situation. So you're the guy that's training me. This world is way too small. This is a simulation. This is all a simulation.
You disbelieve it at first. You're like, no, what?
I'm in the Matrix.
What? You need to ask George to hold the watch and then distract him and then leave so that we have the watch. Or would he murder you immediately?
Oh, no. I have strict instructions. And it goes something like this.
Oh.
Listen, Bullet, when I die,
I didn't want to say
you need to save all of my wrestling artifacts because my kids are just going to sell to the highest bidder. I need you to save every last one of them. I will tell you where all the mason jars are at a certain time, and I will tell you how to divvy them all up with my grandbabies. Just my grandbabies, not my kids.
My mom has the same policy on all her Barbie dolls. They're all in the attic. They're all entrusted to my sister because my mother does not trust me to hold on to them because she has like 1950s like original shit.
Yeah.
And my mom doesn't trust me. George South said Paul Jones kept me out of trouble. When Paul Jones lost the U.S. belt, he said he stayed out of school for 3 days because he was so emotionally devastated by everything. I mean, what George talks about with how much emotional effect Paul had, it really does take you back to when you're a kid, and that first, I don't know if it's even a fictional character, somebody in a movie, somebody in a book, somebody on a show, you identify with them and you have such attachment to them that if their life goes bad, your life goes bad. Mm-hmm. And it's like, shit.
I actually skipped a team required fundraiser in college just so I could see Triple H come out on Raw after an injury.
What the fuck?
And all he did was just come out and do his pose. He just did his pose.
I was waiting for something a lot more, Jake.
No, he just did his pose in the ring. Like right before that WrestleMania where he wrestled Jericho, where he just came back from that torn quad, and he was just coming back on Raw. Like, he was just showing up in like that leather jacket, denim combo, and just doing his thing, looking jacked as shit. But I skipped a team fundraiser and I had to do all types of extra calisthenics. Like, I had a whole physical punishment I had to have the next day, and we did workouts at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
I was told that I had to come in a half an hour early and basically run through the gauntlet just so I could have watched Triple H walk out on a Raw.
I wish I had a good story like I skipped school to see Demolition Man or something, but I really fucking don't.
All right. In April of 72, Paul Jones left the Carolinas and he headed down to Championship Wrestling from Florida. He turned heel and he started going by number 1 Paul Jones. And at this point, Paul had traveled to different countries. He's working the road. He's won some belts. And I think Florida is when it all really comes together and he becomes a standout.
Yeah, Mr. Number 1, Paul Jones. I was going to say Mr. Number 1, George South, because that's literally why George calls himself Mr. Number 1.
Oh, it's very Bruno and Larry with the
Living Legends. Exactly.
In Florida, Paul would catch fire as a singles competitor, winning a tournament for the NWA TV title. He'd work with the likes of Tim Woods, the Great Malenko, Jerry and Jack Briscoe, and Dory Funk. In CWF, he'd win all the belts. Wrestling belts, belts for pants. He'd steal yellow belts from children taking karate. Paul held the NWA Florida TV Championship, the Florida Heavyweight Championship, and Brass Knuckles Championship at the same time.
Damn, that's like Lance Storm in late era WCW.
Paul winning the Florida Heavyweight Championship, though, would lead to Paul Jones a lunger blazing that shit into a river in 1972, throwing the championship belt off the Gandy Bridge in Tampa Bay, an angle that would be copied throughout wrestling history quite a bit.
Stone Cold Steve Austin, I think, did it with the Rock's belts.
Briscoe took the information from there and just like, hey, let's do this angle.
Yeah.
Legend has it that a baby catfish ate the title, and when the catfish grew up, it grew up to be none other than John Cena.
Oh my God. That's the stupidest origin story I've ever heard.
Especially like John Cena grew up in like New England. Like
you and your logistical bullshit.
You couldn't even say Bray Wyatt. Like that would have been a good one because I would assume that he grew up in Florida. Or you say, and that title belt grew up to be Kendall Windham. Like that would even work too.
Kendall Windham, Jesus.
In 1974, Paul left Championship Wrestling of Florida and went back home to Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, where he would settle down and become a mainstay for the company. In April of 74, him and Bob Bruggers beat the Andersons for the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championship. They lost the belts to a very young Ric Flair and Rip Hawk that July. But just 4 days later, Paul won his first Mid-Atlantic TV Championship, defeating Ivan Koloff, and he held the championship until October when he lost it back to Ivan. Paul would win the TV title 5 times over the next 4 years because Paul is Magneto with wrestling belts. Jones and Tiger Conway Jr. would team up and win a tag team championship from Flair and Rip Hawk in December of 74 before dropping the belts back off to the Andersons in 75. Then Paul Jones began feuding with Johnny Valentine. In March of 75, Jones defeated Valentine to win the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship, just to have it stripped from him 10 days later. In May of 75, Paul Jones and Wahoo McDaniel defeated the Andersons to win the Tag Team Championship, just to lose it back to them the next month. Why so many short runs with Tag Championship?
Well, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Crockett's, was a tag team territory for the most part. Like it was always like building towards like a tag team match. You would have an issue with two other wrestlers who would be interjected some way, somehow, and then we would build to a tag team main event. And so obviously the tag team belts had a little bit more prestige than probably the Mid-Atlantic Championship. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of push. That's why
That seems crazy now.
Yeah, but that's what the Crockett's was known in the 70s. It was more of a tag team territory. Awesome. And that's why the Andersons were such a big star. They were the biggest draw.
Yeah.
And it's probably a part of the reason why it was a tag team territory is when you had, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew and Gene and Ole, you're just making tons of money. That was always the thing about Ole. People used to give him a hard time. They're like, you didn't, go to all these other territories and you weren't that big of a draw.
Why would I?
Exactly. He goes, why would I? I was making so much money in Charlotte because it was a tag team territory. We were a great tag team. We were a great foil, and I don't know if they ever were, there's ever a point where they were a babyface. I'm sure they had their fans and they were cheered. But I don't.
There were smart marks back then.
Yeah, I'm sure there were. I'm sure there's people that really appreciated the Andersons. But yeah, like that's basically why there's all this movement, because it's the main belt, it's the main thing, it's the main attraction of the entire territory.
Would you say those are the most important tag belts from all the territory, like the territory days? You
know what? I'm gonna say yeah. I would say probably the one that probably meant the most. That probably it kind of made you a big deal.
Yeah.
If you were the main event tag team in Jim Crockett Promotions in the late 70s, that means you were a big deal. You're probably one of the better tag teams in the country. Also, too, good territory. Yeah. Home every night. You're also making a lot of money because you're going to Richmond, Norfolk, someplace in West Virginia, or you get Raleigh, you got Charleston, South Carolina, you got Wilmington, Columbia. You got all these towns all over the place, and you're making good money. They're large areas. They got big arenas, and if you got a hot angle and you're selling those things out, you're going to make big money.
So on October 4th, 1975, Johnny Valentine, Ric Flair, David Crockett, Bob Bruggers, and Tim Woods would be in the famous plane crash that broke most of their backs, and it eventually killed the pilot. Johnny Valentine was the U.S. heavyweight champion at the time, so sadly and obviously the title had to be vacated. That would lead to Paul starting to work with Terry Funk, first losing to him in the finals for Johnny's U.S. title, and then Paul Jones would beat Funk for the championship in a rematch later that month.
And Terry Funk has, I think, even gone on record as one of his favorite opponents is Paul Jones.
Nice.
Paul went on to trade the championship with Blackjack Mulligan, holding it a total of 3 times before his final reign in December of 76. In 75, Jones began teaming with Ricky Steamboat, having a couple runs as tag champs until December 78, when Jones attacked Steamboat at the end of a battle royal, turning heel.
Oh, let's clarify here.
Because Paul does a lot in shoot interviews.
Yes, let us clarify what happened between him and Steamboat. Now, he started tagging with Ricky Steamboat very early in Steamboat's career. And one of the things the promotions did is they had Ricky and Paul spend a lot of time together in public, because that's one of the things in the territory system. Not only do you have this TV, not only do you have all these promotions that are already, lock and step already with newspaper and radio, that's already just, here's the new information, here's the show, and it's just very easy.
24/7.
Yeah, it's just like a machine as it goes. But also, too, in the territory systems, in the era of kayfabe, especially in a small area like Charlotte, another big thing is when you're out in public and you're friends with somebody, you go and hang out with them. So they made sure that Paul and Ricky did stuff together. They go in they tell them go to a park with your families and just play frisbee, barbecue out, let everybody see how good of friends you guys are. Maybe if you guys want to invest in some businesses together.
It's just so insane.
And Steamboat had a gym, so Paul, make sure you work out at Steamboat's gym. You're really pushing it forward because you're trying to get these people to take it, what you're saying on camera is viable. This is my friend, I will fight for my friend, and I'll die for my friend.
It's like they thought they lived in the age of TMZ or Twitter, where everything they did would be documented and put out there, and they knew they had to do it. But instead of that, it was just word of mouth. Yeah. And with word of mouth, if it was bad, then it was going to just ruin you immediately.
Which is funny, and we talk about the evolution of professional wrestling, the way it's evolved. But if your game is to make people feel something emotional, like you said, in this era of TMZ, when everybody's watching every minute detail, I think you need to take a hint from these territory eras. If you just do it like that and work an angle that way, and then that everything that happens outside in the world in front of people, where they all have cameras, that's all a facade to push along a story. And they pushed along great. Everybody bought that, Paul and Ricky were good friends. And then they have this battle royal, and George tells it in great detail. As it was laid out, it was this battle royal it was one of those famous $5,000 battle royals.
Wasn't it 2 rings?
2-ring battle royal.
Yeah.
And, here they are, the two friends that have been seen barbecuing in the park. Paul works out at Steamboat's gym.
Godfather to my children.
All of those things, all of it. And they're just standing in the ring together, and they're going to split this money together because they're, good friends. And as soon as Steamboat turns his back, Paul throws him over the top. But then here's the thing, though. Here's the kicker. To this day, when people talk about such a dastardly act by Paul Jones, and they ask these longtime fans, and I've seen this happen before at like FanFest conventions, people walk up to Paul Jones and they go, why did you turn on Steamboat?
How could you do that?
And Paul will look them dead in the eye with all seriousness and say to them, I didn't turn on Steamboat. Steamboat turned on me. And
in all his shoots, he makes that a point too. Of all this stuff, when he's doing even shoots, he will keep kayfabe about that fucking ankle.
To the day him and Bob Orton refusing to say that his arm has healed from that when he was in the cast. But before that, also too, to backing up too, Paul would make certain shots to Florida every once in a while. Before he turned heel, he would make shots to Florida, or he would take a vacation or whatever, and he would come back early, and they would do something where Flair would be in a cage and he would just be getting the crap beat out of him. It'd be like Flair versus Ole in a cage with Gene Anderson as a special guest referee, and then all of a sudden it's both Andersons beating up Ric Flair. Then all of a sudden the door swings open at Park Center, and then here comes Paul Jones, who hasn't been in the territory for 2 weeks, comes run in and makes a save and beats the crap out of all the Andersons. They run out of the cage.
Has simultaneous aneurysms.
Yeah, and they're just we didn't even know he was here. So Paul was legendary for doing stuff like that. He would kind of disappear and then kind of come back, especially in about this era, before he turned heel.
In 1977, Jones headed down to wrestle for Georgia Championship Wrestling for several months, feuding with Dirty Dick Slater and winning the NWA Georgia Heavyweight Championship. After turning heel, Jones teamed up with Baron von Raschke. The two of them won the Tag Team Championships in 79 2 times, and they feuded with people such as Flair, Mulligan, Jay Youngblood, and Mr. Steamboat. Jones briefly returned to Florida in 80, performing under a mask as Mr. Florida.
Which I don't know. It's going to be tough for me to do a full deep dive. The whole Mr. Florida thing is of the lines of the Miss America, the Midnight Rider, Yellow Dog. Who is this man? When he's clearly wearing Mr. Number One tights or PJ on his trunks, and they're like, "Who? Hello, Mr. Florida," and the heel's coming out. That's Paul Jones, and he goes, "No, I'm Mr. Florida."
I guess the ultimate is Andre.
Giant Machine. But yeah, it's just that in that vein, I don't know if Mr. Florida was the first of all of that, or it was in the time of all of that, or who was the first. No, I'm this guy. No, you're definitely that guy.
No.
Gimmicks, which Mr. Florida is a gimmick that George has used multiple times before. He has a Mr. Florida hood, and he'll put it on. And even too, here's the funny thing: George runs EWA. And he was the champion as Mr. Florida. And then he booked a match where it was George South versus Mr. Florida. So what he did was he just gave Charlie Dreamer the Mr. Florida hood and goes, "You're Mr. Florida."
Holy fuck.
And then he won the belt back as George South.
I never really thought, just thinking about pro wrestlers and how they emulate stuff and pay homage, but it's almost like with movie shit, I just think of Tarantino and all the stuff he took from Asia and Brian De Palma and all the Hitchcock stuff. Is like pro wrestlers are just like, nah, you're just going to be this other guy and I'm going to wrestle myself. It's going to totally work out because I love this so much. I'm going to do it in the ring.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I don't know if it was this particular run in 80 or it was the previous run in Florida, but it might have been the run with Mr. Florida. I couldn't nail this down as well, specifically in my research with George, which was about my only research. Yeah, but there was a feud with Mass Superstar where Mass Superstar took a lit cigar and put it in Paul and or Mr. Florida's eye. Wow. And it like caused this big outrage. Like there was like the crowd really came up for it because they love Paul so much, and they just it incited this huge there was this whole angle, and those two used to laugh that like we did this $1 million angle with a 50-cent cigar. Like you take the thing that just like costs next to nothing, and we made all this money off of it.
Has there ever, to your knowledge, been a Mr. North Carolina?
I'm sure there has been. I almost positive there has to be. Dixie Dynamite, does that count? That covers the whole South, right?
Mr. North Carolina is Ric Flair.
Well, it was Larry Johnson.
No.
Well,
follow up from Nick. No.
Let's be clear. Ric Flair lives in Georgia right now. Okay.
He has been. He's been doing pep talks for like the 49ers.
Yeah. What is that? Besides money.
We'll do that podcast soon enough.
I really don't know if this is staying in.
Also, too, another interesting thing about Mr. Florida. During this time, Dusty is in basically full control of Florida Championship Wrestling. And Paul and Dusty did not like each other. And kind of a way to illustrate a lot of the friction that were between the two is when Paul was doing Mr. Florida, the promotion was playing a charity softball game against probably the police or firemen or whatever.
Right.
And it was like the wrestlers versus the firefighters or the police officers. They used to do that here in Charlotte, where they had the wrestlers play against the police department. And they used to televise that on TV here in Charlotte. Like we used to have a tape of it at the High Spots office. I don't know.
Used to? Because
I'm sure.
I want to see Dusty sliding into home.
There's a charity softball game with Paul Jones. And Paul was like a big star in Florida, but he was doing the Mr. Florida gimmick at the time of this charity softball game in Florida. Let's remind everybody, in Florida. Outside softball, which is where softball is played, is outdoors.
Yeah.
And obviously Florida, we know how hot it can be. Yeah. So Paul's like, hey, Dusty, I know we're doing this Mr. Florida angle. I'm already a big star as Paul Jones. Can I just play softball for this charity softball game?
For the love of God, so I don't die.
As Paul Jones. It's not like I'm wrestling, because we got the whole thing where I can't wrestle, but I just come in and I play softball. And Dusty's like, nope. Wow. Baby, you got to put that hood on. Damn. And so there are pictures of Paul Jones playing a charity softball game as Mr. Florida, almost at near death, sweating profusely, sweat through the entire hood, out in the hot Florida sun playing charity softball.
Like, how's Paul doing in outfield? And you just cut to Paul laying down passed out in the outfield. Oh, he's doing great.
Yeah.
What a weird tan line a lucha mask.
Especially that one, because the squares like right around the face.
By 1980, he'd be back in Jim Crockett, and he'd get another tag team championship run, this time with Mass Superstar, beating Jimmy Snuka and Ray Stevens. They'd trade the belts with Ivan Koloff and Ray Stevens before finally dropping them to the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. In 82, Paul would feud with Jack Briscoe, trading the heavyweight championship back and forth. I watched one of their matches, and it is maybe the best work the leg match I have ever seen in my entire life, which is saying something because 70% of pro wrestling matches are work the leg matches.
There's actually a match somewhere online, not to give away too many secrets of professional wrestling, but in American professional wrestling and most professional wrestling other than Mexico, but even luchadors have acclimated to the style that we work the left side.
Yeah.
And there's a match where Jack Briscoe and Paul Jones are working the right side for some unforeseen reason. And George saw this match and was like, oh, they're working the right side on a couple of these spots. I was like, oh, I can't wait to point this out to Paul and let him know he screwed up and he was working the right side. So he went over to Paul's one day when they were hanging out in his later years, and he brought up the match with Jack Briscoe, and Paul's like, oh yeah, I remember that match real well. And George goes, do you remember when you were working the wrong side?
Boom, got you.
And then Paul just stood there stone-faced, and he just looked at him and he goes, listen, kid, when you're good, you can do whatever you want. And George's like, oh, okay.
Now go get me some coffee.
Yeah, go get me some coffee. So, but yeah, I always remember that, when I think about stuff like, well, you told me to do this and I can't do that. And I just look at like young students like, listen, kid, when you're good, you can do whatever you want.
By 1983, the business was kind of catching up with Paul. His back was in awful shape, and this would more or less end his in-ring run, or at least it would give it a major drop-off. And that's when Paul forms the Paul Jones Army as a manager. Some members of the Army include Masked Superstar Rick Rude, Manny Fernandez, Superstar Billy Graham, Ivan Koloff, Abdullah the Butcher, and the Powers of Pain.
Barbarian and the Warlord.
Since Paul could cut an amazing promo, he'd be a great manager, a great mouthpiece for his roster of villains. You'd also kind of get the three faces of Foley with Paul Jones as a manager. There was tuxedo-wearing 007 Paul Jones.
Ooh,
there was cowboy hat Paul Jones. And the collector's edition, Hitler Paul Jones.
Oh.
As leader of the Paul Jones Army, he'd feud with the Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant, which it would eventually lead to him getting back into the ring in '84. Any thoughts on that feud?
Well, other than the tuxedo match, and then Jimmy Valiant just coming out with a tuxedo shirt on, and Paul Jones in a full tuxedo, and just taking like the entire tuxedo off of Paul Jones. And that's the thing. That's really the only example a younger generation of fans have of Paul Jones wrestling.
Because that was a Starrcade or something?
Yeah, it was like a Starrcade. So you go on the network, that's really kind of your only example of Paul Jones. And, about this time, George was obviously doing a lot of jobs for Jim Crockett Promotions. Yeah. And so anytime George would be wrestling job matches against anybody managed by Paul Jones, George would be in the ring and tell whoever oh, throw me out of the ring, and he would get thrown out of the ring just so he could sell over to Paul Jones so he could take a punch from Paul Jones.
Oh my God.
That's how big of a mark George was. Or he would sell over to the rope so Paul could hit him, or something, just so Paul could hit him. And then later in years, well after Jim Crockett Promotions, this was probably the last couple of years of Paul's life, George would book Paul to be a manager. And one time George had Paul as his manager, but then he had a situation set up where Paul was going to accidentally punch George, and George did something. He goes, punch me, Paul. And Paul's like, no, this doesn't make sense. And
but no, I'm ready.
I'm ready. And so mid-match, they're having an argument, and then they fought all the way home.
This is the equivalent of if I got to write a screenplay and Bruce Campbell and, I don't know, Chow Yun-Fat was in the fucking movie. That's what George got to do.
Yeah,
and that's kind of amazing.
And they also had, during this time, they had NWA trading cards. And George had an NWA trading card, and they asked on the back, who's your favorite wrestler? And George goes to Paul, who was managing at this time, and still kind of doing the tuxedo matches or whatever, and still coming out and wrestling every once in a while. And George goes, Paul, is it all right if I refer to you as my favorite wrestler on the back of this trading card? And Paul said no. Paul was like, no, I'm not done wrestling. So George was like, on the back of my trading card, it says my favorite wrestler is Johnny Weaver. It is not my favorite wrestler.
I just want you to know. I just want you to...
It is not my favorite wrestler. I love Johnny Weaver, but he is not my favorite wrestler. Paul Jones is. And actually, I was going through some 3/4-inch tapes not too long ago, probably about a year or so ago. And it was footage, I believe, from probably 1988, 89, maybe early 90s. And on there was a tape label, I think Great Lakes Wrestling Association. They had Jerry the King Lawler and Kamala as the main event, And this is obviously around not far
Michigan?
from... Yes, Michigan and Ohio, but it's closer to Ohio because they had a Cleveland Browns player in the audience, and Jerry Lawler had this amazing Cleveland Browns wrestling gear. It was of
course he did.
It was unbelievable. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen before, and I was just on a car ride with Jared, and I'm upset I didn't ask him about it because it was cool.
You were just in a car ride with Jerry Lawler?
Like a couple of weeks ago.
Oh.
But
just a throwaway.
But on that same show, there was a match between Ivan Koloff and Paul Jones. And Paul still looked amazing.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, like this is... I can't believe I unearthed this out of nowhere. There's this random match from Paul Jones, and he's just wrestling Ivan Koloff in this random show out of nowhere. So even as a manager and doing these tuxedo matches, he still didn't see himself as retired.
By the start of the late 80s, the territory Paul had become a legend in, Mid-Atlantic, had been bought up by old Teddy Turner. Paul was mostly out of the ring managing, and I believe he was doing a little bit of backstage stuff. When Paul left WCW at the start of 1990, he spent the next few years on the Indies, including Tri-State Wrestling in Pennsylvania and North Carolina's South Atlantic Pro Wrestling. What is that?
Oh, I'll tell you all about that.
Yeah, because I was what the fuck is that?
Yeah, it's North Carolina, so I'm like, I've never heard of it.
Oh, I know a lot about this. So once Jim Crockett Promotion was bought up by WCW, and when Crockett turned into WCW, they were obviously, there's this push for them to run more towns that are across the globe because it's TBS, and it was even that feeling in like '88. Jim Crockett Promotions was kind of trying to be more global and push more to like Dallas and California and Chicago.
We're gonna take over the world.
So like all of the Anderson, South Carolinas, the Gaffney, South Carolinas, the Lenoir, North Carolinas, the Shelby, North Carolinas, a lot of those, stable towns that drew very well for Jim Crockett Promotion for all these years, they were getting left out of the equation. And then, of course, once the full sale happened, WCW is becoming a thing. They're trying to be a national brand, and they're wrestling in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and all of these other places. So there's this need in this area, and there's this demand. So I believe it was a collection of, I think maybe George Scott might have been involved. Nelson Royal was definitely involved. There's this conglomerate of guys that all came together, and they just decided they're like, we're going to start running these towns that got left out through the purchase of Crockett by WCW. We're going to start running the Gaffneys, the Shelbys, the Wilmington, North Carolinas, the Fayettevilles.
Fayetteville, yeah.
And we're just going to start running, and they were going to run it like an actual territory. And they actually had like actual people here. They had the Nasty Boys. They had Ken Shamrock.
What?
Yeah, I think he was Vincent Tortelli here. Like the famous fight with the Nasty Boys where they beat the shit out of Ken Shamrock and threw him in a dumpster. Yeah. It was when they were working for South Atlantic. It's also where Tatanka got a start, and they brought in like Ricky Steamboat to kind of endorse Tatanka when he was like Chris Chavis. And so they would run all these smaller towns in North Carolina and South Carolina that were neglected. Yeah. And as you mentioned, like Paul was involved in that. So they got some of the guys that were just kind of knocking around. I think Manny Fernandez was involved, Jimmy Valiant. So like they got some of the guys that didn't go fully over to WCW or got left behind or a little bit older, and just like, let's get them in here to kind of pull off of what Jim Crockett Promotions had. And they even went as far as the ring skirts looked exactly like the NWA ring skirts when Jim Crockett Promotions used to run. It was like the yellow trim on the side with a blue field, and then they had the gold letters that matched the trim. Wow. Instead of NWA, they had South Atlantic Championship Wrestling. So they're running it like an actual territory, and they're running all the smaller towns, and they're just going to do it exactly like Jim Crockett Promotion did in the early 80s, and they were eventually going to start building, and of course it eventually folded. But they had TV, and they were running stuff, and like I said, I think Sandy Scott was involved. I don't know. Like I said, I think I said George Scott, but I'm pretty sure Sandy Scott was involved, because once that folded, not too long after that, Sandy Scott was involved in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and then Smoky Mountain kind of absorbed some of the stuff that South Atlantic was doing in the North Carolina area.
So in 1991, Paul Jones retired for good as an in-ring performer. After retiring, he'd open up a body shop in Charlotte, North Carolina, just so he could have one more feud with the Briscoes. From there, he and his body shop relocated to Atlanta. He'd run his body shop, hit the shoot and convention circuit, do some sporadic managing, and just kind of enjoy the life of a retired pro wrestling legend. Paul Frederick died April 18th, 2018 at his home in Atlanta, Georgia, at the age of 75, the exact same day as Bruno Sammartino.
Oh, wow.
No official cause of death was ever released to the public, but as far as professional wrestlers go, dying in your house at a fairly old age, accomplished, respected, seemingly happy, not the worst way to go.
Pretty damn good.
Yeah. Final thoughts on number 1, Paul Jones. To me, anytime we cover someone that literally no one has a bad thing to say about, I'm always very impressed. Like, he wasn't in drama, he wasn't in controversy. Paul is someone I definitely missed, seeing as his entire career was before I was alive. But going back and checking him out, he's obviously a great worker. He has a great, passionate way of talking to get people into the building. To me, I guess the most impressive thing coming from the era that I came up in, I guess, watching pro wrestling, he wasn't jacked on roids. He wasn't wearing tassels and face paint with $1 million of vignettes and marketing. Yet he was able to like stand out just talking and wrestling. Like that's crazy to me. And he was able to leave a mark on wrestling fans, and on future performers. I will also put him in the top 3 pro wrestling mustaches of all time, behind Rick Rude and Jake Manning.
Kiss ass.
Fuck you, Joe and Ryan.
Paul Jones is one of those old school dudes that you watch and you see older footage and you don't get the full angles or everything, but you see the matches and you see how fucking over he was, and you know right away that he had a connection with the crowd. You know that he sucked them in, told a story. He rocked his babyface gimmick for all it was worth, and he made them care so much. He beat the hell out of the heels, and they cheered and cheered, and he knew how to story tell his ass off. Like we said, Paul, I mean, he was a good-looking dude. He was built. He was quick. He was that identifiable look that every man in the crowd to be like, yeah, man, I'm in there beating ass. Him and Big John Studd were engaged in the best and longest bear hug I have ever seen in my life. They milked it like standing up, then they milked it on the knees, and then it went to the mat. They're laying on the mat doing the bear hug, and it was impressive. You got to see where things come from to where they are now, and I think Paul Jones is a great example of a dude who had so much talent in so many areas.
You guys have gushed over him, and I could just repeat the same exact thing. But when I think of Paul Jones, I have to get this out into the world very clearly and let everybody know about this specific thing. And it is Paul's finish, the Indian Deathlock.
Oh, yeah.
Airplane spin, dump the guy off, Indian Deathlock. Everybody gets it wrong what the Indian Deathlock looks like, because everybody's doing the Indian Deathlock the way that Harley Race does the Indian Deathlock, which, okay, that's a variation of it, but that's not the way that Paul Jones does it. I've seen people put pictures on Instagram and go, oh, Indian Deathlock, tribute to Paul Jones. Like, nope, that's not how Paul did it. That's not how Paul did it at all. And just to kind of give you a little bit of history of the Indian Deathlock, it was a hold that a lot of people think started with a Native American wrestler who may or may not have been Native American, because that's the way wrestling was. A guy by the name of Chief Bald Eagle or something Eagle to that extent. And then Jack Briscoe picked it up, but Jack was the one that was kind of showing it to Paul, and they were using it in their feud together. And the variation of it from everything else, because the way that Harley does it, it starts off with like the figure 4, and you end up kind of onto the guy's side, like almost like you make an L with the guy's body, and then you're pushing your foot up against the guy's knee. It's not the way that Paul did it. It starts off the same way with the figure 4, where you do the turn, and then you take the foot and you tuck it in the opposite leg's knee pit. But here's a little trick. You take that foot that's wrapped around all that, and you just take your foot and you put it in front of that person's foot that has their foot tucked in the knee pit, and then you push that in a little bit. So therefore, you've got their legs wrapped up with one of your legs. Yeah. And then you stand...
It's ankle pressing against ankle?
Yeah.
Right.
And you get it in there, and then you fall backwards. And then you take like a bump backwards, so it looks a little bit like a figure 4. Yeah. I've even heard people, when I do it, people are like, oh, he's got the trailer hitch. I'm like, not really. It's not at all. It's actually the Indian Deathlock. I've only seen one other indie guy do it like that, and he was trained by Susan Green. So like, it's just like you see somebody who's trained by like an old timer. Like that's the way the Indian Deathlock was. So the way Harley did, I always felt like it was like a little mistake. Like Harley heard Jack Briscoe talk about doing this, and I was like, I think I got it, and he did it, and then everybody saw Triple H do it on a pay-per-view. I'm like, oh, that's the Indian Deathlock. Yeah. That's not the case. It is not the case at all. And George learned it from Paul, and then George taught it to me. So I've always been very protective of the Indian Deathlock, and I always try and use it at appropriate times. Like I just happen to have a little spurt in my career where all of a sudden I've had 3 heavyweight title matches in the span of a month.
Yeah.
And each one of them, I've gone out of my way to use the Indian Deathlock. Just kind of as like an homage.
Sorry, not to butt in, but have you finished with it?
I mean, I was going for the finish. I had the guy lined up, and then a guy jumped off the top rope and gave me a frog splash.
Oh, fuck.
On top of me while I'm in the Indian Deathlock, which a lot of people don't know. When you lock in the Indian Deathlock properly, you're lying down like you would for a figure 4. So guys, that's why I don't do it very often, because when you lock in, guys, especially if you're locking in as a heel, they're like, oh, I'll just reverse it like Flair and the figure 4. No, you'll die. You will die if you try and reverse. Yeah, when you see the way that I lock in, which is the way that Paul locked it in, it's remarkable to see. And if you ever think about reversing it, and guys have been locked in it, they're like, oh, that's a legit hold. But really, my leg is just wrapped around you just so. I have you with one leg, and that's the amazing part of the entire hold. And what Paul always would do is if the guy reached the ropes and grabbed the ropes, if you have the figure 4, you can get out of it pretty easily. And the guy who's got the hold applied, he would just pop up and get out.
Right.
What Paul would do with the Indian Deathlock, because it was so dangerous, is once the guy reached the ropes, he'd have to tell the referee, like, you have to unlock it. I can't unlock it. You have to move my foot, because it's that dangerous if I try to unlock.
Cut our legs off. That's the only way to get out.
He had such a believability behind it. It just speaks to like how much care and craft to everything that he had. That he had that much craft behind the Indian Deathlock. They're like, no, I can't release the hold. I have to have the referee release it. But yeah, it's just one of those things. Every time I lock in the Indian Deathlock the way that Paul did, it always makes me think. And then when I see people do it wrong, it makes me think about how misunderstood and how we don't really understand this guy who was regarded as one of the best ever by some of the best ever. And that's what I think is nice about this podcast. We get to shine a light on that. So as my final thoughts, I just want to let people know what you think is the Indian Deathlock is not the Indian Deathlock. Watch some Paul Jones.
I think there is some YouTube footage of him applying it properly and stuff. So go look that up.
Go look that up, and let's bring that back. So let's just have all you young kids start doing the Indian Deathlock properly. If I could do anything to change professional wrestling, just have all the young kids actually do the Indian Deathlock properly.
Or just the world in general. Let's make the Indian Deathlock the new super kick.
Yeah, let's make the Indian Deathlock the new super kick. So hopefully this podcast can do that.
It's called the crisscross applesauce Deathlock, you racists. All right, so if you enjoyed this episode, head over to our Patreon, where you can support this podcast like the parents of a millennial with 15 college degrees. Patreon.com/10bellpod. You can also support us for free by leaving us a review wherever you're listening to this. Follow us at 10 Bell Pod on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We'd love to hear what you think about these episodes. Leave us some feedback. Find us at 10bellpod.com, and this podcast is part of the Six Squirrel Studio family. You can find Jake at Manscout Manning on all the social medias. Micah is JTrotter27 on Twitter, and I am Nicolessa on all the social medias. Bye. Hello, 10 Bell Pod listeners. Thanks for listening to this episode, but I wanted to take just a second to give a big shout out and an even bigger thank you to a few people that have donated to our Patreon. Micah, the Man Scout, and I would like to say thank you so much to Rebecca Foster, Damian Lumadou, Margaret Taylor, and Miles Kane. Whether you gave $1 or $50, every penny gets us a step closer to the goals we have with this podcast, including doing more episodes, switching to weekly, putting together a live show, and also all the random sketches, shorts, and dumb ideas we've been cooking up that we want to get out there to you. If you'd like to support this podcast, you too can buy into some of our cool tiers we have on patreon.com/10bellpod. That's patreon.com, the number 10 bell pod. Thanks again.